So the next big bite out of Chapter 2 is putting some of these things we just learned about all together. Why do we learn about atoms? Why do we talk about water so much and carbon? Well, here you're going to see. We're going to start to get into this. So for the first part of this lecture series, I'm going to talk about monomers and polymers. We're going to learn about carbohydrates. We're going to talk a little bit about how polymers are made and broken down, and then we're going to talk about lipids. Okay, so we've talked about the kinds of atoms that make up most of our bodies of all living things, and we can take all of those carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen atoms, throw in a few others, and we find that they are arranged in all living organisms, for the most part, into four broad categories: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. There are a number of other biological molecules in your cells, but these are the most abundant. And they're also the largest. We call them macromolecules, which means giant molecules, because they can be very big and very complex, but they become big and complex because they're made up of smaller, simpler units. So that's what we're going to talk about during this set of slides here. Here's Neil deGrasse Tyson. Hopefully you can hear what he says.
And after all, what is biology if it's not the most complex expression of chemistry we know?
After all, what is biology if it's not the most complex expression of chemistry that we know? So if we go out elsewhere in the universe, Dr. Tyson is an astronomer. We find there's a lot of chemistry going on out there, but it's nothing like what we see in living structures here on Earth as far as we know. So, question, learning objective 13, fairly straightforward. What are monomers and polymers? Okay, so giant molecules are made up of many parts. And these small parts or the units are called monomers. So a polymer, which means many parts, polymer, is a long molecule which has many similar units or building blocks. And those repeating units are called monomers, which means one part. So 3 of the 4 classes of these giant molecules we're going to talk about are going to be considered polymers. And lipids are kind of just they're not polymers. They're just biggish molecules, but they don't have these same kinds of repeating units and to form thousands or millions of subunits, as you will see. So every cell in our body has thousands of different macromolecules in it, different types of carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids. Within a large multicellular organism, different types of cells may produce different macromolecules. And the macromolecules that are in my body are probably a little bit different from the ones that are in your body. The variability increases as you get to more distantly related organisms. So the macromolecules in my dog and in my cat are more similar to me than to the mushrooms that are on my pizza or the bacteria that are living in my gut. But all living organisms have these 4 major types of large biological molecules. It's a universal thing to all life as far as we know it. So the first one I'm going to tell you about are carbohydrates. You may have heard of carbohydrates. The main purpose of carbohydrates in the body are to serve as a fuel, as an energy source, and they also are important for building up materials inside cells. So carbohydrates, another word for carbohydrates are sugars, and complex, very long chains of sugars, or polymers of sugars. And you're going to see this prefix SACCH. It means sugar. Monosaccharides are simple sugars. Disaccharides have 2 monosaccharides. Polysaccharides have a lot of these units. So, like saccharin, the artificial sweetener, and the word saccharin in general just means very, very sweet. And that is from the Greek word root meaning sugar or sweetness. So, monosaccharides are simple sugars that are usually found with a molecular formula of CH2O repeated some number of times. So, for example, glucose, you've probably heard of glucose, is C6H12O6. So just imagine CH2O multiplied times 6, and that gives you this molecular formula for glucose. But glucose is not the only type of simple sugar out there. There are others. Monosaccharides are classified by where we see that carbonyl group, C, that has a double bond to an oxygen atom. They can be aldehydes or ketoses. And then we have the number of carbons in the carbon skeleton. So 6 is a very common number, but as I'm about to show you, that number may vary. So here are 6 examples of simple sugars, monosaccharides. Here are 3 carbon sugars, or trioses. OSE, like glucose, pentose, hexose, ribose, ribulose. Maybe you're detecting a pattern there. And the pattern is that OSE also tells you that that chemical, that named chemical, has a carbohydrate in it. So saccharose means carbohydrate. OSE means carbohydrate. So pentose means 5 carbon sugar. Hexose means 6 carbon sugar. And you can see the pattern here. 3 carbon sugars, C3H6O3, 5 carbon sugars, C5H10O5, and 6 carbon sugars, C6H12O6. So it's that CH2O pattern times however many carbons are in the molecule. You'll also see a couple of other commonalities. All of these simple carbohydrates have a carbonyl group in it, a C double bonded to O, like I talked about at the end of the last set of videos. And it can be at the end of the molecule, like you see here in glyceraldehyde, or it can be in the middle of the carbon skeleton. So there's carbons on either side of this guy, and we call that a ketone. So you'll also have noticed that both of these molecules, if you count up all of the atoms, all of the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens, they have the same molecular formula, but different arrangements of the covalent bonds. So take a second and think, what does that mean? That makes them something you should know. They are isomers of each other. So same molecular formula, but a different arrangement of the covalent bonds, which tells you not only are they isomers, but they are structural isomers, a different arrangement of the covalent bonds. Okay, so we're actually going to run into all of these sugars at one point or another during the semester. And I will say, remember when I showed you that slide with those 6 sugars? Well, here's one of them. Hopefully that'll happen. And hopefully we'll remember to look back at this slide. Okay, so we can draw these sugars as linear skeletons like you just saw in the previous slides, but often in the presence of water, which is what's always surrounding these molecules inside cells, the sugars are going to form into a ring. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. Monosaccharides are a very important fuel source. And we can use them also as building materials, but they don't really form into good building materials unless we get a whole bunch of these monosaccharides linked together. Just like think of them like bricks. One brick is not going to give you a very good house. What are you going to do? Put the brick on your head when it rains? That would not be very good. So, but if you have thousands of bricks, you can build some really cool stuff. So here's that ring form I was talking about. Here is glucose, C6H12O6. Count if you like. You don't. No, it's back to 2. But in an aqueous solution, this first carbon is going to attach to that oxygen that's on the 5th carbon, and it makes this ring that kind of looks like a hexagon. And no, you don't have to memorize all of this. Just know that this is what water will do to a linear form sugar, is make it form this ring structure. And in the next few slides, you're going to see these green hexagons. And when you see the green hexagon, you should think, oh, that is actually just glucose that they've drawn a shorthand for. So disaccharides are a thing. It's when you have a dehydration reaction, whatever that is, joining 2 monosaccharides. And there's a covalent bond, and that's called a glycosidic linkage. That's just the name for that linkage between a couple of monosaccharides. So we can combine 2 molecules of glucose to form a disaccharide, or another fairly simple sugar called maltose. If you add a glucose and a fructose molecule together, they form this thing here, which is called sucrose, which is the most common type of, when you get table sugar, when you get a bag of sugar at the store because you want to make some cookies or a cake or something, that's what you're getting. You're getting a big old bag of sucrose. So it's a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. Polysaccharides are polymers of sugar. And one thing that they can do is they can be used to store up that sugar that we use for energy, but they can also be made into more permanent structures. And the monosaccharides are going to be the same, more or less, for different polysaccharides, but it's the way that those linkages are put together that make a huge difference in, is it going to dissolve? Is it going to get broken down in our body? Or how is it going to be made? I'm going to pause here and move on to the next thing. Okay, I left you with some complex carbohydrates. What do we mean by complex carbohydrates? What we really mean is big, long chains of those monosaccharides. So one way that plants store polysaccharides is in the form of starch. And starch is when a plant photosynthesizes and turns carbon dioxide into sugar, it needs to kind of have a place to store it all up. It can't just use all that sugar right away, so it's going to make the sugar during the daytime, and it needs to use some of that at night. So rather than having it just all sitting around inside the cell, you need to have a convenient way to store it up. So plants use starch to store carbohydrates that they might want to use again for energy. And sometimes they store up so much starch that they don't get to use it all, or we come along and we harvest them. Maybe we'll harvest some potatoes or some wheat or corn, and then we'll eat that starch. So one form of starch is called amylose. Again, you can see that OSE ending tells you it's some type of carbohydrate. Here are another couple of types of carbohydrates as well. Here you can see all of these green hexagons that show you that this is just glucose that has been connected to other glucose molecules by a glycosidic linkage. And you can see that this starch is kind of spiraling around and around and around when it's in this chain like this. And that is a true thing. And it's a little bit different from what we see in these other polysaccharides, these other polymers of sugar. So starch is how a plant stores glucose. In our own bodies, in our liver, we store, if we eat a lot of food, we want to store that energy. We use a different type of polysaccharide that's called glycogen. Another word that also means sugar that you're going to see a lot is this GLYC, like glycogen, glucose. It's the same word root. It comes to us from, and if you are in the fraternity or sorority system, maybe you know that the Greek letter upsilon sometimes represents Y, sometimes represents U when you transliterate that into English. So gluco and glyco essentially mean the same thing. And it's just yet another tip that you're talking about a carbohydrate. OSE, glyco, gluco, and the other one that I said. Anyway, glycogen we store in our muscle cells, we store it in our liver, but we're always needing to use energy for moving and things like that. So we tend to cycle through glycogen. We don't have like a big glycogen deposit. Usually, if glycogen sits around for a long time, it gets converted into fat. And once it's converted into fat, that's kind of like, so as an analogy, storing the clothes that you aren't currently wearing in a closet, that's kind of like glycogen. Glycogen is like the clothes in your closet. The clothes that you're wearing are like glucose. And then maybe you've got clothes that you want to store for whatever season it's not, like store your winter clothes in the attic for summertime. That's kind of like deep storage, and that's like fat as far as how we store these molecules for the purpose of harvesting energy. So anyway, there's glycogen for you. That's an animal polysaccharide. And it's similar to starch in that it's got this helical or spiral-shaped appearance to the molecule. Glycogen tends to be a bit more branched than starch, but they're both kind of have the same kind of function. Another type of polysaccharide that is made by plants is called cellulose. And not all plants use a whole lot of starch or have huge starch reserves like we see in a potato or in a grain of wheat or a grain of rice. But all plants produce this polysaccharide called cellulose. Cellulose is the most abundant polysaccharide in the world, by a lot. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is there are a lot of plants out there in the world because they're doing the work of photosynthesis, which feeds all of the animals on the surface of the earth directly or indirectly. And plant cells, all of their cell walls have cellulose in the cell wall. That's why it's called cellulose, because originally found in the cell walls of plants. Cellulose is different from starch for a couple of reasons. One is you'll notice that these chains of cellulose are not helical, not squiggly. They are very straight, very linear. And that linearity makes it a lot harder to break down, actually. So these helices, these spirals up here, are very simple to break down and convert into energy by the plants that produce them or by animals that eat them. But cellulose is a different story. Cellulose forms these long, straight chains that stick together very well. They'll hydrogen bond to each other that make very recalcitrant, very hard to break down rope-like structures. So there's not a lot of organisms that can actually digest cellulose on their own. And this is, it's neither good nor bad. It's good for us because if your house is a wooden house, it's made out of cellulose. The paper that maybe you're writing on, or any piece of paper that you use, is made out of cellulose. Toilet paper is made out of cellulose. If you're wearing cotton clothing, that is made out of cellulose. And these are all materials that you don't want them to break down very easily. They're supposed to hang out and last. Their initial function is to provide structure for the plant. But then we have a lot of uses for cellulose after we harvest those plants. So there's starch again. Glycogen, as I said, is that storage polysaccharide that animals use, that we cycle through very quickly on the daily. It looks kind of like that. Again, it's helical. And then in addition to storage polysaccharides that kind of keep that glucose tucked away until it's ready to be used, once cellulose is formed, it's permanent, more or less permanent. There's not a lot of organisms that can break down cellulose once it has been formed. And why? The monomers, the parts, the monosaccharides are the same. It's how those glycosidic linkages work together, how the molecules are put together, that make cellulose so tough. This is not stuff you need to worry about. Nope. Don't worry about it. Nope. Don't worry about it. Okay. Another type of structural polysaccharide is called chitin. That's how that word is pronounced. I see people who read the word and then they'll be like, "What's chitin?" And I'm like, "No, it's actually called chitin." It is a structural polysaccharide. Arthropods, so insects and crustaceans and spiders, use chitin in their exoskeletons to give them some protection. And that chitin is toughened up with other things like calcium in it. But chitin is also found in the cell walls of fungi. So it's kind of a weird thing, you might think, that like a bee and a caterpillar might have the same kind of stuff as you would find in a mushroom. But there it is. That's the truth. In both cases, with arthropods and fungi, the basic subunit is glucose that's been modified a little bit into this stuff called N-acetylglucosamine. So here's N-acetylglucosamine. You can see here's the glucose apart, and it's got some more. Here's an amine group. Here's a carbonyl group. And so a little bit different, but again, goes into the exoskeleton of arthropods like this cicada here. If you've ever played out in the woods in the summertime, you may have seen one of these empty shells of a cicada. But chitin's also good because it's strong, but it is broken down by the body. So if you have the dissolving sutures, if you get stitched up from a surgery or from misadventure, then you might be getting stitches with a type of sterilized chitin.